the ruling party takes over the state and uses it and politicizes it, and does so successfully enough so that he or the party can't lose another election. So the point of doing it is to stay in power indefinitely and to remove the level playing field that democracy is supposed to ensure. I mean, it's interesting, if you think about it, democracy asks a lot of people. So it requires you, when you win an election, to preserve a system that will allow your enemies to defeat you 4 years from now, and it also, requires you, when you lose an election, to sit patiently while your enemies rule the country and then seek to win power the second time, legitimately using according to the rules, and the temptations to cheat there are very high if you're, especially in very partisan political systems. But democracy requires you to continue respecting the idea of a level playing field, that elections are out of the realm of politics. The actual institutions of the election, the counting the votes, the system is not something that anybody's allowed to mess with. But you also have to preserve, again, an idea of rule of law, an idea of judicial independence, an idea of some media independence. And that's asking a lot of people. And democracies ask a lot of citizens, in that they ask them to be able to tolerate a change of power and this legitimate rotation of leaders. Whereas, in autocratic states, that is prevented. I think it's also, many people have written about this as well. You can sometimes tell in advance when a political party is going to try to do that because of the language that they're using about the system or about themselves. We've used very often in the last few years this word populism, which I actually dislike because, in America, there was a populist movement in the 19th century, which means something a little bit different. And populism sounds fairly bland anyway and sort of nice. I mean, it sounds like it just means that you're popular. So I don't like the word. But when the parties that we've been talking about as populists, what we often mean really is autocratic. So I sometimes will say autocratic populists. And that means political parties that describe themselves as the only legitimate party, like only we are allowed to rule. And we represent the real people, the real Americans. And our opponents are foreigners or elites or traitors who shouldn't count and who should never be allowed to rule. And so when you have a party like that appears in a political system, that is a kind of dangerous moment. And there's a lot of that language around right now in the United States, in different forms. And that's a sign that the language of the autocratic world is here already with us in our political culture. But again, the important piece of it also is that all of us have in our minds this idea that democracy ends with some kind of coup d'état, right? There's tanks and there's a colonel shooting up the White House and there's blood on the streets and so on. But actually, in the modern world, that's not how democracies end. Mostly, they end through this silent process of corrupting institutions, changing the judges, altering the rules, changing the civil service, capturing the state. And that's the thing that we should be aware of and worried about, not a coup d'état.
That is so powerful. And your definition of autocratic populism is so helpful. Looking at history, I'm trying to define what the founders meant by demagogues. And one characteristic seemed to be efforts to consolidate power in one person and undermine the Constitution and the rule of law to challenge democratic elections. And when, as you say, it's happened before, in American history, Aaron Burr appeared to have conspired to do this by fomenting a revolution in Spain and setting himself up as dictator of Mexico. Huey Long, perhaps, is the best example of the...
we have one of our podcast episodes is about Huey Long.
Just one more beat, because it's crucially important. It sounds like party competition is crucial to preventing that kind of autocracy. And do we find around the world that it's the consolidation of power in one person and one political party that characterizes autocratic populism?
It's the consolidation of power in usually in one person, actually, kind of personality cult. sometimes in a party. But a lot of it is the intentions of that person in that party. Are they trying to change the rules? Are they trying to reset and rewrite the rules of the system so that they can never lose? And that's the key element. How are they trying to change the system in order to stay in power indefinitely? And as I said, there are many examples, left wing, right wing, of people who've tried it in the U.S., in other countries. It's not the desire to undermine democracy and stay in power doesn't belong to any political party or movement. You can find it in plenty of places. But that's the thing to watch for, and that's the thing to try and understand. And it's why listening to what is said about the civil service, about the courts, about the media. This is why it's important to listen to those things, because it's in criticizing and attacking those institutions, as well as, of course, the institutions of elections and vote counting. It's listening to those things that will tell you somebody's intentions.
So powerful. All right. Well, back to the book. You describe, although autocrats come to power in different ways, sometimes from liberal democratic systems and other times from illiberal systems, you describe the ways that they preserve power, which they share in common. And those include security collusion. Autocrats exchange repressive techniques to remain in power, and North Korea and Iran supplying Russia with armaments for Ukraine is one example. Cuba, a secret policeman to beat up protesters in Venezuela. Talk about security collusion.
Mm-hmm. So again, in the book, I talk about different ways, whether it's through shared propaganda or whether it's through shared financial tactics, or the quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one dictatorship investing in the quasi-state, quasi-private companies of another. They share surveillance technology, but yes, they also increasingly cooperate in the realm of security and the military. And this was obviously the most dramatic example is the North Koreans supplying ammunition to Russia to fight the war against Ukraine, and the Iranians supplying drones to the Russians, and maybe possibly even ballistic missiles. That's a recent story. The Chinese have also enabled the Russians in a different sense. They have continued to supply components for the Russian defense industry. And there's even a recent story. There was a Reuters investigation, and then I had also heard about it from another source, that the Russians are building drone factories in China. So some of what they've learned from the war, they're beginning to deploy in order to create a drone arsenal with the help of the Chinese. That hasn't quite yet risen to the level of international diplomacy, but if true, it would show you a different way in which it works. And don't forget, there would be a reciprocal arrangement. So there's also now evidence that the Russians are supplying anti-ship missiles, or thinking about doing it, to the Houthis, who are a Iranian proxy, who are believed to want to use them against, American or other ships in the Red Sea. And so this would be another further destabilizing factor. So once these regimes begin to spread and share very sophisticated weaponry, we're already entering a different kind of reality. Again, it's rumored, and I can't say that it's true, but I mean, think about the significance of Russian and Iranian nuclear collaboration, if that were to happen. The Iranians don't have nuclear weapons yet. They allegedly are very close. The Russians do have them. If the Russians were to begin to help them, that would, again, it would speed up the process of nuclear proliferation. So that they've begun to share weapons and that they share these security strategies is also new. A few years back, the idea that Putin would be accepting help from North Korea was kind of unthinkable, and the Russians were even played for a time a somewhat constructive role in enforcing sanctions on Iran, and that's obviously that whole world is now gone, and will not come back. So they begin to see an interest in mutual creation of havoc, and I should say another piece of that story is now unfolding in Western and Central Africa, where, in effect, the Russians have a kind of security offer for dictators and would-be dictators. They'll provide mercenaries who will help them attain power. Maybe the Chinese can invest and help them out with their economic problems. In exchange, they want access to I don't know, diamond mines and other natural resources, whose profits they can then take and employ to make their kleptocracy function. I mean, they're beginning to also look around the world for other kinds of alliances and other ways in which they can back up and support dictators or as I said, would-be dictators who want to take power. And that's not a totally unfamiliar. I mean, it's not unlike what the Soviet Union did in the 1970s in Africa, but it's now returned, and it's a particularly ugly version of it. And so the Wagner mercenaries in Africa are not very interested in human rights. They are very happy to beat people up and kill them. They don't abide by any laws, either local or international. And they are now, as I said, they're not exactly an arm of the Russian state. They operate semi-privately, semi-not. But they now have to be understood as a factor in African politics. And that's part of the same system. It's part of the deterioration of norms and the attempt of Autocracy Inc. to assert its values and to install its values in more places.
You also talk about the enabling of propaganda through new technologies and state-sponsored misinformation, which operates transnationally to support autocratic narratives. Lots of powerful examples: a Russian outlet promulgating a Chinese narrative to Facebook, or the story of the secret U.S.-funded biolabs in Ukraine, falsely claimed to be experimenting with bat viruses. Talk about how new technology has enabled misinformation.
This was for me a real revelation. So at the very beginning of the war, the Russians, started with the Russian diplomats, I think at the UN, began talking about supposed biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And the purpose of them talking about this was to somehow muddy the waters. I mean, they'd invaded Ukraine and they were looking for some way to muddy the narrative and make it complicated. And they claimed that there were these biolabs, they were called, in Ukraine. It was debunked completely. It was even debunked at the Security Council. There's no evidence for it, and it's not true. Okay. Nevertheless, this went out on China's vast international media network. So the many television stations, radio stations that either the Chinese run themselves or they run in partnership with African and Latin American and Asian countries. The Chinese have a lot of content sharing arrangements with other countries. It went out in the Venezuelan news network as a story. It went out in all kinds of strange websites that look like they're from Ecuador or Argentina, but are in fact run via Moscow. And the story was even repeated in the United States. Tucker Carlson used it on one of his programs. There was a Twitter post that had many, many millions of likes that described the fake biological labs. So the story spread, and when you just look at the spread of that story, you see how the autocratic network works. Again, Chinese state media, Russian, fake media, but real U.S. pundits who are pro-Russian or who are pro-autocratic, and you see them working together to spread the story. And it's very hard to measure the impact of something like that. I did see a statistic that said something like 30% of Americans believed it. I haven't seen any surveys in Asia or Africa, but when you see a story like that in many different places, when you see it on Twitter and then you hear it on Tucker Carlson and then you read it on another website, which you don't realize is actually a Russian website or a Chinese website, you hear it from a lot of different places, you might believe that it's true. And so it's evidence of how, again, completely false story without even any real attempt to justify it, made the rounds through this autocratic network all over the world. And that was just one example. And of course, there are many others.
You also talk about the assault on international norms and institutions, and autocratic countries try to rule back rules-based international order. And you say that we should think about the struggle for freedom not as a competition with specific autocratic states or war with China, but a war against autocratic behaviors, whether found in Russia, China, Europe, or the US.
Yeah, I'm very anxious that people not think about this as a new Cold War. I don't think there's like a geographic divide and there's good guys on one side of the Berlin Wall and bad guys on the other. And I don't think the world is black and white. I think there are a lot of countries in the middle. There are autocratic states who don't seek to undermine the West. I mean, Vietnam is a dictatorship.